If you're watching this video, then you've probably noticed the influx of high-level wrestlers coming into the sport of submission grappling. Names like Jason Nolf, Helen Maroulis, and Lucas Byrd, and many more have been competing in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And this all begs the question, what are they doing here? Guys, this is Sean with PDMA, and today we are going to take a look at all these wrestlers that are coming into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the effect it's having on the sport. However, first we're going to go over some of the reasons these wrestlers are coming in, and some of them might not actually be what you expect. We're also kind of going to take a look at some of the wrestlers who are coming in and doing a great job adapting to the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu community, and we're going to take a look at a few that are, shaking things up a bit. But before we get into that, if you guys are interested in the latest Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and submission grappling news, please click that subscribe button. That helps me out a lot. That out of the way, let's get into it.
You're not going to have the most intelligent human being in the sport of wrestling like some of us, articulate, high social skills people in jiu-jitsu. You know what I mean? It's basically jocks versus autistic people.
So when we talk about wrestlers coming into jiu-jitsu, when we talk about wrestling as a whole, I think it's important to look at the current state of wrestling that's actually making some of these wrestlers want to transition over to this sport. And so if you're not from the US, or even if you live in certain parts of the US, you might not understand just how deep wrestling runs in the culture in some parts of the US. And wrestling is actually very important to the tradition and cultures of countries outside of the US as well, but I live in the US, and this is where I'm recording this video, so that's what I'm going to talk about because that's what I know. And I'm actually in kind of a unique position because I actually grew up in an area in the US where wrestling isn't that popular. I actually didn't even hear of wrestling until I was in high school. I didn't see it in the Olympics. I don't know, I just never heard of it. Now I live in Pennsylvania, and if you know anything about Pennsylvania, the wrestling culture here runs very strong. People start wrestling when they're children, and a lot of people wrestle through high school, and if you don't wrestle yourself, then you know somebody who wrestles, and you're familiar with the sport and how it runs. So why then do these wrestlers, when wrestling is such an important part of their culture, want to switch over to a different sport? And I think the one issue that wrestling has always had is that it is very difficult to make money doing your sport. Now, a lot of people, obviously, they go and they wrestle in college, and then they go and coach, or they're involved in wrestling in some capacity, but actually wrestling and making money, it's very difficult. Even if you're an Olympic athlete, if you want to continue wrestling into your adult life as a professional wrestler, there are very, very limited options. And so one natural thing that wrestlers have done in the past in order to make money and keep competing is to start competing in something like MMA. And it makes a lot of sense. Wrestling is a very integral part of mixed martial arts, and traditionally good wrestlers have done pretty well in leagues like the UFC. And now there is another sport that for some wrestlers is actually a more logical route to take, and that's coming into the world of professional submission grappling. More money is coming into this world, and the wrestlers are taking note, and I think a lot of them are saying to themselves, well, I have this competitive grappling background, and now there is a competitive grappling sport where I can make money. It kind of only makes sense. And if you really think about the logic, I mean, if somebody told me, hey, you could do this one job and get kicked in the face, and you can do this other job and not get kicked in the face, I think I know which one I'm going to choose. But unlike MMA, we in the submission grappling world need to figure out exactly where we put these people. And let me explain what I mean. So when a wrestler comes into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, they really have two options. One option is the traditional route. It's the route we all took when we started competing, and that's to enter a local tournament and work your way up. Now, you can see why there might be issues with this, because somebody with a strong wrestling background can train jiu-jitsu for 6 months, and they are at a different level than most people when they just come off the street with no grappling background, come into a jiu-jitsu gym and train for 6 months. And so this is going to cause some sort of inequity on the mats. And now a lot of leagues have taken steps in this, and they do understand that, right? So if you have some sort of wrestling background, if you have a certain wrestling pedigree and you enter a tournament, a lot of times you do have to compete at at least a blue belt level or something like that, especially if you're talking about an IBJJF style tournament where the ranking system does mirror the belt ranking system. But I don't think this is just unfair to the other competitors. I actually think this is a little unfair to the wrestlers, because you have somebody like Helen Maroulis who comes in and she had a run at blue belt in IBJJF. Now, she is a blue belt in jiu-jitsu. That's where her jiu-jitsu skill set is. But she ran through, and now all of a sudden the internet is accusing her of sandbagging, even though she is rightfully a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And so the other option is to seek out higher level competition, and there's obviously a lot of issues with that. namely being that most of these people haven't taken the time to develop their jiu-jitsu skill set. And now here's where I want to talk about a real issue that I see in our community going on, and that's promoters bringing in wrestlers with very, very limited submission grappling experience, putting them on these big cards, and then almost setting them up for failure, and in a lot of instances just making a very boring match for the fans, and it just kind of ends up hurting the card. So while there are many examples of this happening, I do want to point to one example that happened recently, and that's when Lucas Byrd, who is an NCAA champion, was put on the main card of Fury Professional Grappling.
Bird's got a 6'3" girlfriend!
And he ended up getting tapped with a very basic triangle. And before I go any further, I do just want to say, this is nothing against Lucas. I actually had the opportunity to train with Lucas when he came down for this Fury match. I took a class from him, got to train with him a little bit. He is a very, very nice person, very professional athlete, but I think he was kind of put in a position where he was sort of set up to lose, and I don't want to be too harsh because I do know some of the people that organized that particular card, but I think that kind of points to a bigger issue here, and that's that a lot of these cards are putting these wrestlers on before they're ready. And, you know, the obvious reason for that would be to pull in the wrestling crowd. You know, take a crowd that already likes grappling and bring them into our sport. So I think the idea is there. I just think the execution lately has been a little flawed. And I really can't bring up this topic without talking about a name that I'm sure you've been expecting me to bring up, and that's Jason Nolf.
The champion in St. Louis. It's another one for Penn State, Jason Nolf.
And if you aren't familiar with Jason Nolf, I could sit here and name all of his wrestling accolades for the rest of the video and we'd be here all day, but he's a 3-time NCAA champion, by all accounts, one of the greatest wrestlers to really ever live, and he's been competing in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu a lot recently. And Jason has been on a number of professional submission grappling cards, and he was also featured on the UFC BJJ Road to the title. And this is something I want to get into because if you watch his first match versus Elijah Carlton, you know, the match is chopped up in such a way that might not reflect how it actually went. Without giving too much away, I have spoken to people that were there and did watch this match, and I was told that maybe this match wasn't as close as the UFC wanted you to believe, and I think it's kind of obvious what they were doing. They really want to build the name of Jason Nolf as a professional submission grappler, and I think they did take some liberties in cutting up this match the way they did. From what I've been told, Elijah won pretty definitively, and if you watch what the UFC released, it makes it look like it was a much closer match, and it also led to one of the most awkward moments of the entire UFC BJJ Road to the title, and that was while they were waiting for the judges to render their decision. Jason Herzog, who's a very professional, experienced ref, turns to Jason Nolf and says something about the submission that he put on in round 2. It was just very awkward, very weird, and it really just felt like the UFC was trying to force something on the viewer.
Almost out. There's a steam alarm. It's close. Close.
And so while I agree it is a good idea to try to get the wrestling crowd in, when we do it in ways that are somewhat inorganic, I think it takes a lot of us who are already in the community and turns us off. And I know this particular instance really made me look at this whole UFC BJJ Road to the title thing a little weird. There have definitely been other wrestlers who have come into the world of submission grappling under controversial circumstances. Most notably probably being somebody like Pat Downey, and that's as much as I'm gonna say on that. And just to name another name, hey, Craig Jones is competing against Gable Steveson, so there's that too. And that's not to say that I somehow think that all these wrestlers are coming in here and causing all these problems in the jiu-jitsu community. Believe me, the jiu-jitsu community is very good at causing problems for itself. And I actually think that an influx of high-level grapplers into our sport is a very good thing, and we've seen many people make this transition very successfully in the past. And probably the person who's had the most success, at least monetarily, coming from a wrestling background into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is Nicky Rod. I mean, the guy went from, he wrestled in college, he wrestled in high school, he wrestled as a kid, came into the sport of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and made a pretty big name for himself, not to mention made a literal $1 million doing the sport. And Nicky Rod isn't the only person to have done something like this. You have people like Michael Pixley, who has been very successful in submission grappling. I mean, a lot of people remember his run at ADCC this past year in 2024, and especially his match where he beat Lucas Byrd, and then he actually got to go on to compete against Nicky Rod at the UFC Fight Pass Invitational, and has really, really made a name for himself, and he's only a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so he's got a really big future ahead of him, but his core is still in wrestling. And these two, of course, aren't the only wrestlers that are coming into Jiu-Jitsu and doing very well. You have people like Brandon Reed, who has been doing phenomenal on the ADCC circuit. You have people like Helen Maroulis, who is a literal Olympic gold medalist who has decided to come into our sport and is really shaking things up on the women's side. There is no shortage of wrestling athletes coming in and, in my opinion, improving our community. And all of those people have one thing in common that, in my opinion, is a major reason why they are successful, and that's the fact that they have come over from wrestling, but they have embraced Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And so what do I mean by that? Well, by that I mean they came in from a sport that they were doing very well in and were able to say, okay, that was that sport, this is this sport. I can't rely on the things that I was doing or the skill set or my accolades from wrestling to succeed in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So what they did was they learned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I know doesn't sound like a big deal for those of us who came into Jiu-Jitsu with no grappling experience, but I give these people a lot of credit. They came in with a skill set that can probably get them kind of far in the world that they entered, but instead they decided to actually learn the sport of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Now, a lot of you haters out there are currently going to be saying, no, I watched Nicky Rod's first ADCC run. I get it, okay? He did a lot of wrestling. Watch the guy since then. He's become very good at Jiu-Jitsu. And I think a lot of us have seen this in our own gyms. I mean, I know I personally have. You have somebody that comes in with a pretty good wrestling background, and they come in to roll for the first time, and then they get beat up by every purple belt in the gym, and that person has a decision to make. They can say, oh wow, I thought I had a strong grappling skill set. Turns out I don't have a strong grappling skill set for this particular grappling sport. I should learn. I should put on a white belt or, no-gi, whatever. I should come to a beginner class and I should start learning the skills. And I think the people that have that mindset have the potential to do extremely well in the sport of submission grappling. If they can take all those skills that they learned from their wrestling background, combine it with the jiu-jitsu that they will now be learning, I think that makes a pretty formidable competitor. Or you could take the other route where you come in, you get beat up by those purple belts, and then you leave the gym and never come back and go talk to your friends and tell them jiu-jitsu's gay. And not that this is what this video is about, but I do find a lot of times that second guy is the kind of guy that goes home and goes on the internet and comments on my video about how lame guard pulling is and how you should have to wrestle in jiu-jitsu. And you guys know if you watch the show, I don't have a lot of strong opinions on these things. And even when I do, I don't like to share them. But I have a very, very strong opinion on people who make fun of guard pullers because they're dumb. But I have a separate video about that. I'm going to link that here if you guys want to check that out. And now is my favorite part of the video because this is the part where I get to ask you guys what you think. How do you feel about this influx of wrestlers into submission grappling? Do you think it is a overall good thing for the sport, or do you think the negatives outweigh the positives? Either way, let me know in the comments. If you guys have not been in my comments, I selfishly, personally think that I have the best comment section on YouTube. We have some great conversations down there in the comments, so please drop all of your opinions down there in the comments. And if you guys got any value from this video, or you just want to be kept up to date on the latest Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and submission grappling news, please go ahead and click that subscribe button. That helps me out a ton. With all of that being said, I just wanted to say thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.